have a $50 to $100 million a year overlay program. $50 million will overlay about 200 to 250 miles of highway a year. That doesn't go very far when you're talking about 16,400 miles. It means you can overlay every highway about once every 80 years, which is not reasonable, but it's about the minimum level that you need to really keep from losing a lot of these. Then the midterm, in 3 to 5 years or so, a total of $250 million, which would be $140 million beyond the short term. So that would ensure that we could match our federal aid. That would let us have an enhanced overlay program and maintenance program. We could overlay somewhere between 400 and 500 miles of highway in a year. More money for sealing highways, more money for our maintenance operations and things of that nature. Then the longer term, which we're calling up to 10 years, a total of about $400 million when you combine it with those other targets. And what that would allow us to do is have a substantial overlay program and to have money available for an economic development program, a capital improvement program, where you can continue to make progress on widening highways and doing things that are really going to enhance economic development around the state. And then ultimate, and this really comes from our needs and our shortfall, we had $1.7 billion additional annually. That means that you start to do things like build I-49 and build I-69 and finish Highway 67 up to the Missouri state line. And we know that's a huge stretch, but just to let you know what we would be able to do with some of those target levels of funding. It's still not everything, but another $400 million a year, and you can make a lot of progress toward being able to meet those system preservation needs and a lot of those needs around the state to enhance tourism, to enhance economic development and things of that nature. So that's really it in a nutshell, and pretty quickly to kind of give you a range of needs. $110 million short term, not too long after that, $250 million a year, and then ultimately, and in thinking about what we talked about in the last meeting of something that is reasonable. Not that we're going to have everything and we're going to meet every need, but something that is reasonable to allow us to have the kind of transportation system we really need.
Craig, you're recognized.
Scott, just so I'm clear, using, for instance, the immediate short-term target of 110 million, that's 110 million to the department?
That's 110 million to the department, yes.
So given your 63.5% that you showed us in the funnel chart, that would require a gross of 173 million.
If you keep that traditional split, then the ultimate need coming into the state is greater than this. Or even if you just limit it to the highway revenue distribution formula in the 70-15-15 with cities and counties, you don't put more money into constitutional and fiscal agencies and things like that. It's still more than what we're showing on the screen. That is correct.
Randy, you recognize.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking down the road, what does the half-cent temporary sales tax yield annually at this point, and what's it projected to yield when it expires?
The average that I remember is about $230 million total, which is about $160 million to the department. It's estimated to grow at about 2% a year or so. We're changing our projections every couple of years. We're 2 full years into it, and we're probably a little less than $2 million under projection so far for the first 2 years. So, after collecting almost $320 million, $2 million low is not that bad. It'd be better if it's $2 million above. But I don't know what it would be at the end of that time, but on average, it's about $230 million a year and $160 million to the department. And here's another point also. The share of that half-cent sales tax that's going to cities and counties increased the turn back to cities and counties by 40% a couple of years ago. There are a lot of new mayors and new judges that have walked into these jobs in the last couple of years that see this turn back revenue and they think, hey man, this is what I've got to spend. In 8 years, it's fallen off the table. And that's something that they need to be really aware of.
All right, any other questions?
No, that's not in the funnel chart because it was voted on as a constitutional amendment and dedicated to this specific program. So it is not in the funnel chart and it's going to go away in June of 2023. But because it is dedicated to a specific program of projects, it's not in the funnel chart. That is correct. That's the only revenue. That's the only source that we get that is not in the funnel chart.
All right, very good. Thank you for that information. And I imagine that this last bit, the funding needs, the timing of the needs, that's something we'll probably revisit at every meeting, just kind of, continue to evaluate those numbers based on what we learn and see and as we decide where we want to go. So that's very good information. Thank you for that. We'll move now to item C, which is a discussion of the existing highway revenues as well as tax-based funding issues. And John Tice is here from the Department of Finance and Administration to give this presentation. Committee members, y'all all have a copy of this right there in front of you. Members of the audience, we have a few copies back in the back on that table. We'll probably need to share probably two to a copy if you pick one of those up. We only have a limited number, but we'll start going through that. And at this time, I'll recognize Mr. Tice for his presentation. And I think one thing that before you get going, we'll probably go through section by section, let him present one grouping, and we'll take questions on that. Then we'll move along, and then at the very end, we can have questions over the whole presentation. So, Mr. Tice, you're recognized.
Mr. Chair, committee members, my name is John Tice. I'm the Assistant Revenue Commissioner with DFA, and I'm not very technical in nature, so this is my version of a PowerPoint, and that's what I'll be referring to during my presentation. And as the chair said, the presentation is broken down to describe to you the various revenues collected by the Department of Finance and Administration, where those revenues are defined by state law to be highway revenues. And the presentation is broken down first, looking at those tax revenues that DFA collects. Then second, we will look at title and registration fees, basically motor vehicle related fees. And then the final section deals with driver license related fees that are dedicated as highway revenues. Beginning on page 1 of the packet, I start out by showing you gasoline and diesel fuel consumption levels and tax receipts over the last 10 years. And you see that the total receipts from fuel taxes has declined over the last 10 years from about $455.8 million down to $435.7 million last year. And I'm going to use some terms as we go along. If I use the term motor fuel, that's the term used in state law to describe gasoline. If you hear me use the term distillate special fuel, that's the term used in state law to define or describe diesel fuel. The chart there on page 1 does show you that the taxable gallons reported to DFA for both gasoline and diesel fuel over the last 10 years has declined for each fuel type. You also see LPG or liquefied petroleum gas and compressed natural gas there, and I'll discuss those in a little greater detail later on. The Arkansas tax on gasoline is currently 21.5 cents per gallon. The tax on diesel fuel is currently 22.5 cents per gallon. At the bottom of page 1, I've outlined the tax rates in each of our adjoining states for you for comparison purposes. And then on page 2, I give you the gasoline tax history. That tax was first adopted, I believe, in 1921 at 1 cent per gallon and has grown to the current level of 21.5 cents per gallon, which was first enacted in 2001. and then the tax has remained at that level since 2001.
Let's go ahead and stop there. Are there any questions on any of that at this point in time? And I may have interrupted you before you finished that section. Apologize for that.
Not a problem.
Scott, did you have a question real quick?
Well, not a question, but just a comment, and I know a lot of times we look at, we compare ourselves to surrounding states, and ours is higher than surrounding states, but I believe all of these surrounding states get some sort of revenue other than motor vehicle or motor fuels taxes and registration fees.
Okay.
I do want you to gain an understanding too about how the tax is collected. We're all familiar going into a business and buying an item, and the merchant collects sales tax, and then that merchant sends the sales tax into the state. Well, motor fuel taxes are collected a little differently. Surely when you go in and buy a gallon of gasoline or a gallon of diesel fuel, the tax is already incorporated into that price. However, the tax is paid to DFA by the motor fuel wholesaler. That wholesaler pulls fuel out of the pipeline and then distributes that fuel to a series of retail stations. When that wholesaler sells the fuel to a retailer, the wholesaler collects the tax from that retailer, and then that wholesaler is responsible for remitting the tax to DFA on a monthly basis. The tax report is due on the 25th day of the following month. So fuel sold in July of 2015 will be reported, the tax will be reported on that fuel to DFA by August 25th, the 25th of the following month. And that is true for both gasoline and diesel fuel tax. And Director Bennett earlier was talking about some things that reduce the ultimate collections to the state, and beginning at the bottom of page 2, I have a couple of additional items that Director Bennett didn't mention, mainly because they're more tax related than they are related to the distribution of the funds. The first is the border zone provision. As you saw, all of the surrounding states have a fuel tax rate for gasoline that is less than the Arkansas fuel tax rate. And retailers in those border areas certainly were concerned that it put them at a competitive disadvantage, possibly with a station directly across the state line. A border zone area is defined to be a city that adjoins the state line, a city that adjoins the city that adjoins the state line, or if you're not within the city limits, a station that is within 800 feet of the state line. And state law provides a special border zone rate for those stations in those border areas that is 1 cent per gallon greater than the tax rate in the adjoining state. So for example, the tax rate in Texas on gasoline is 20 cents per gallon. So rather than collecting 21.5 cents, a motor fuel wholesaler will collect 21 cents, 1 cent more than the Texas rate on the gasoline distributed within that border area. The effect of that border zone provision around the state is reflected on page 3 in the middle of the page. You'll see that the border zone costs Arkansas about $3.7 million per year in collections from the gasoline tax. The other provision that reduces collections is the shrinkage allowance. State law of about 33 of the states, 17 states do not have a border zone law, but Arkansas and all of our surrounding states have a border zone provision that recognizes that as fuel moves from the wholesaler to the retailer, fuel gets lost for a variety of reasons. It can be evaporation, it can be shrinkage due to temperature changes, it can be spillage, things of that nature. And the result is Arkansas law provides that tax is not due to the state on 3%, or they get a 3% discount on the first 1 million gallons of fuel sold in the state each year. That's 1 million gallons maximum per wholesaler. The result is if a wholesaler has 1 million gallons against which to claim the shrinkage, then they save $6,450 per report, or a total of $77,400 per year. That shrinkage allowance reduces revenues to the state by roughly $5 million per year. And I've provided the shrinkage allowances in each of our surrounding states on the top of page 4. And you see they vary widely. Oklahoma shrinkage allowance is limited to 0.1%, whereas I think Missouri's the highest at 3.1%.
Shannon, you're recognized.
I just have a question for clarification. The text on page 3 says 1 million gallons sold per month, but in your comments you said per year. I'm just looking for.
It's per month.
Okay.
That's really all I have to say about gasoline. I'd move on to diesel fuel unless there were questions.
And also on any of the alternative fuels, were there any questions on any of those? I think we had, or is that, so you're going to go across the list?
I will
Okay.
discuss the alternative fuels a little later.
Okay, okay. Well, let's, proceed. Go ahead and proceed. Thank you.
The tax rate on diesel fuel, as I mentioned, is 22.5 cents per gallon. That rate was established in 2000 and has not been increased in the last 15 years. And you see at the bottom of page 4 the tax rate history from 1941 to current, showing how the tax is collected. As Director Bennett mentioned earlier, these fuel tax revenues are subject to the 70-15-15 distribution between highway departments, cities, and counties. Director Bennett also referred to the petroleum environmental assurance fee. I only mention that for one limited purpose, and that is if someone told you what the fuel tax rate is and you said it's 22.5 cents on diesel fuel, they'd say, oh no, I pay 22.8. The difference is a 0.3 cent or 0.3 cent per gallon fee that goes to the Department of Environmental Quality, and that money is used for cleaning up petroleum spills and gasoline and diesel fuel spills. I would like to spend a little time talking about the International Fuel Tax Agreement because it's something that's very important with regard to the trucking industry and how Arkansas imposes fuel taxes on interstate trucking. When you and I purchase a tank full of gasoline for our car, let's say we're traveling to the east and we stop in West Memphis and we fill our tank up. The Arkansas tax is paid on all of that gasoline we put in the tank, and even though we consume that fuel, maybe in the state of Tennessee, Arkansas gets the tax. The same is not true for an interstate trucking company. Interstate trucking companies essentially pay the fuel tax based on where the fuel is consumed, not based on where the fuel is purchased. This is accomplished through a mechanism known as the International Fuel Tax Agreement. Basically what a trucking company will do is they will register and obtain a fuel tax reporting license in one state. That state becomes their base state. And each, periodically, that trucker will file a report with their base state showing the miles they've driven in all states and the total fuel purchases in all states. A company that drives its vehicles in a state and consumes more fuel than it purchased will then be required at the end of that reporting period to pay additional tax to the state, or if the company bought less fuel, bought more fuel than they consumed in the state, they would be in a net credit posture. The point being that a trucking company will always pay the same amount of fuel tax regardless of where they bought the fuel or regardless of what state's license plate is displayed on that truck. An example might help a little bit. A trucking company that's, say, based in Tennessee that travels 1,000 miles in Arkansas during the reporting period, and that trucking company calculates a mile per gallon of 5 miles per gallon. That trucking company, 5 miles per gallon into 1,000 miles, should have consumed 200 gallons of fuel in Arkansas. So that trucking company owes Arkansas fuel tax on 200 gallons. If that trucking company bought no fuel in Arkansas during the reporting period, they would report to their base state that I owe Arkansas tax on 200 gallons of fuel. Conversely, if that trucking company had purchased 300 gallons of fuel in Arkansas but only consumed 200, then the trucking company would be in a net credit posture for Arkansas and be entitled to a credit for the 100 gallons more that they purchased. But the point being that fuel for an interstate trucker is based on the fuel consumed in the state, not on the fuel purchased in the state. Another important point is other states have looked at some ways other than a fuel tax to impose a tax on interstate truckers. And that's fine, whatever a state does is up to them. However, for the interstate or international fuel tax to work, the tax has to be convertible to cents per gallon. So that's very important. If this group or the legislature were ultimately to look at other sources of revenue to make it work with interstate trucking, the tax has to be convertible to cents per gallon.
So John, for that reason, other states that have looked at some kind of percentage or indexed amount, they do it based on a formula that converts back to cents per gallon. Is that correct?
That's correct. The legislatures of those states have given some state official, usually a revenue official, such as Director Walther, the direction to use a formula and periodically convert that tax to a cents per gallon and publish that information for usually an upcoming year or an upcoming 6-month period.
Okay, thank you.
I will briefly mention.
John, actually, I'm going to jump in again. Senator Sample has a question, I believe. You recognize.
And John, this may be included on that, the United States and Canada, but what about the trucking firms that come from Mexico? Are they included in this agreement?
They are not included, no. This is just United States and Canada.
So do we not collect any fuel tax from those trucks? Because that amounts to a great deal.
I'm going to have to ask my folks who know more about this than me.
Most of them do not because
Come on up. This is Rodney Richard, and Rodney is our
I thought that would be included in the NAFTA agreement.
Rodney's our motor fuel manager, and he may know the answer.
most of the trucks that run into the United States coming from Mexico do not meet the specifications for safety reasons. So they're not allowed to go travel the miles in the United States at all. They're stopped in Texas.
So the trucking firms that I see that carry a Mexico address are trucks that do not, I mean, they're actually trucks that are used only in the U.S. and even though they're flagged in Mexico.
Now, our trucks can go into Mexico.
That's not what I'm saying. You see a lot of trucks that are they'll have their license on the side of their truck saying Hermosillo, Mexico, or something like that. Now, do we not collect taxes on those trucks? I mean, on the middle fuel at those trucks?
They are not a part of IFTA. Now, when they go to purchase their fuel, if they're traveling around the states, then they do pay the tax. But as far as being a part of IFTA, sharing the tax, no.
Okay, so if they fuel up in Texarkana and drive across the state of Arkansas, we don't receive any of the tax revenue off that fuel?
No, sir, but I'm not aware of any trucks that are actually based out of Mexico traveling in the United States.
Well, I think that you need to look at the NAFTA agreement then.
Okay, but coming from IFTA standpoint, from what I understand, we were not allowing them to travel in the United States if they were based out of Mexico.
I drive up and down the interstate all the time and I see them every day.
Senator Sample, I may let Shannon jump in if that's okay. And do you have some additional information you can
Sure,
provide?
I just wanted to confirm that I believe that the gentleman is correct, that there are less than 100 carriers authorized to travel under the agreement, the NAFTA agreement. There's a pilot program, and I think that the number of carriers that qualifies is 30-something. So there's only 30 carriers that have the authority to extend beyond the trade border where they come across and
Okay,
right down.
how many trucks do those 30 carriers have?
I couldn't tell you, but based
Because
on
that
the,
could be
sure.
300,000.
I can get that information for you, but it's a very, 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 very small number.
And Senator, I'll be glad to try to get the information and clarify that for you in time for your next meeting.
Okay, because I've facilitated some transportation forums with Mexico and Canada. And as I was led to believe, there's a good many trucks that are on the road from Mexico.
We will research that and have it ready for you in advance of your next meeting.
All right, any other questions on that part? If not, John, or actually Representative Douglas, you're recognized.
Just a quick question on the fuel shrinkage discount. Has there been any scientific research what that real figure is? Because it looks like it varies from state to state.
No, sir, not that I'm aware of. That's been a provision of Arkansas law for, it predated me coming to work here 35 years ago, and I'm not familiar with any research since that time.
Okay, thank you.
All right, John, you can go ahead. Thank you.
Sure. Mention just briefly two other minor sources of revenue for the state. First is liquefied gas special fuels, or LP gas. The other alternative fuels, compressed natural gas and liquefied natural gas. Over the years, LP gas has never been a huge source of revenue, and it has declined precipitously, as you can see on the chart on page 1. That tax is paid by a decal fee. When I was a boy growing up on the farm, there were lots of farmers in the area that all had LP tanks in the back of their trucks and paid this annual decal fee, and the number of those have gone down significantly over the years. But that decal runs from $64 to about $609 a year. That is a one-time per year fee that is paid on a vehicle using LP gas. The fuel source that is growing, although it's still a very small source, is alternative fuels, compressed natural gas, and liquefied natural gas. Compressed natural gas, back in 1993, the General Assembly decided that compressed natural gas should be taxed at 5 cents per gallon, gasoline gallon equivalent, as long as fewer than 1,000 vehicles were registered in Arkansas to use compressed natural gas. As the number of vehicles registered increased, then the tax rate increases. As late as about 2 to 3 years ago, Arkansas had between 250 and 300 natural gas powered vehicles. Over the last couple of 3 years, that number has grown to the point today we have between 650 and 700 natural gas powered vehicles. And on the chart on page 1, you can see how the fuel consumption for compressed natural gas has increased. But until we reach 1,000 vehicles, the tax will remain at 5 cents per gasoline gallon equivalent. And then you see the chart on the middle of page 6 that will show you how the tax will grow up to a maximum of 16.5 cents per gallon equivalent as the number of vehicles increases. Liquefied natural gas is, you see there's none reported through FY 2014. As soon as we get the FY 2015 numbers, you will see some liquefied natural gas reported. There was a single LNG station has opened in Arkansas over in West Memphis, and I believe there's a second one that is either under construction or in process. Liquefied natural gas is really an alternative to diesel fuel for interstate truckers, and that's the goal of this industry, is to fuel large interstate commerce vehicles using LNG. And that's an industry that's in its infancy, but one that certainly needs to be watched closely because of its potential impact on interstate trucking. Be glad to answer any questions you have about the fuel taxes themselves.
Senator Sample, you're recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. John, we gave them a real nice rate about 2 or 3 years ago as far as the natural gas powered trucks that went up.
Gave them what?
A real nice rate. And I think that rate was what, 5 cents a gallon?
Yes, sir, that dates back to 1993.
Okay. But are we collecting that from the interstate truckers now? Because I'm seeing more and more of the major truck lines going to the natural gas powered trucks.
Yes, sir, we are. We have several fleets inside Arkansas that currently use CNG, particularly up in the northeast part of the state. Some of those companies actually helped construct the fueling station up in that part of the state, and we do collect the tax from those fleets.
Okay, all right. And that other, isn't there one in Fort Smith?
The LNG station, that's where the second one was scheduled. Last I knew, I didn't know if it was actually up and operating yet.
I don't know if it's up or not. Okay, thank you.
Guy, you're recognized.
Do you have a consumption for off-road diesel and gasoline burn for non-highway use?
We do not. Off-road gasoline, you pay the fuel tax on gasoline that you use off-road. Off-road diesel is taxed in a totally different manner. There's a tax, I believe it's 6 cents per gallon. Off-road diesel has a dye added to it, and the dyed diesel is taxed at 6 cents per gallon, and I don't have those consumption numbers with me.
It's not included in this information?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you.
No, this is just on-road diesel.
So John, looking back at the front page, you have a CNG column that shows that the revenue's been increasing there, but under LNG, there's no numbers. Is it just not measurable yet, or?
No, you notice that the years there, this only goes through fiscal year 14. The reason for that is at the time this chart was put together, the last report for fiscal year 15, which would be the June report, was not due until July the 25th. So we did not have that report. When you see the 2015 numbers, you will see some LNG consumption, although it will be fairly small.
Okay. And then how does LNG fit in with if you have LNG trucks coming through the state? I guess they're just filling up wherever they fill up and they get our tax rate. Ultimately, is that?
They follow the same IFTA rules as with diesel fuel, just at the lower tax rate of 5 cents per gallon.
If they are registered in another state, like say you had 10,000 LNG trucks a month come through Arkansas, that wouldn't necessarily impact this number of vehicles, 3,000 and over. It wouldn't impact the rate that's being paid.
No, sir. State law says it's the vehicles actually registered in Arkansas. So a vehicle registered in another state that consumes fuel and reports fuel tax in Arkansas but is not registered here